Greetings from Stanford University. I'm Bill Barnett, professor at the Stanford Doerr School of Sustainability and the Stanford Graduate School of Business.
And I'm Sophia Qin, a sophomore at Stanford University studying in economics and mathematics with a particular interest in environmental economics.
And Sophia and I have with us today for the podcast Professor Patricia Bromley. And Tricia and Professor Sarah Soule from the Stanford Graduate School of Business, now Dean Sarah Soule, ran a conference here at Stanford on civil society and environmental sustainability. And Tricia, thank you so much for joining us. There were some really interesting papers there, but maybe before we dive into things, you could help our audience understand, what do we mean when we say civil society, and why would we think of an intersection between civil society and sustainability?
Sure. Hi, Bill. Hi, Sophia. It's really great to be here with you both today. I'm thrilled to be back on the podcast and to talk about the conference that Sarah and I organized. So this concept of civil society, it's really to get at the parts of the world that aren't covered by government or the market. So it's a very broad understanding of what it could mean. But kind of if we think of three sectors, there's government, business, and then society. And civil society is the parts of society that are working to make it a better place in some dimension. And for us, this conference, the focus is on the environment, as you say, Bill.
I see. Well, that's a big, that casts a wide net. And let me just ask you, Tricia, of all the various things that came up at the conference, what surprised you most?
Yeah, sure. It is a very wide net. So this is the third year we've been doing this conference. And this year we had more of a focus on social movements. So we looked a lot at social movement activism as a sort of narrower slice of activity within civil society. I'd say one of the most striking things from the conference was, maybe there are two things. I have to give you both. One was a specific presentation by Dana Fisher at American University, who for more than 20 years has been interviewing activists at protests. So she attends protests and asks people various kinds of questions, including environmental protests. The most striking thing she found is that in the past few months, so literally the past 6 months, there's been a huge jump in the support for political violence expressed by activists at various kinds of protests. So environment, but also protests about protecting science and sort of cutting across different themes. So that was really shocking and ended up being a big topic of conversation throughout the conference. So increasing support for political violence on various domains. The other was the importance of the cross-cutting issues of domains. So yes, the environment, but there was a lot to be learned, for example, of how we can build coalitions from looking at faith-based movements. So we had one speaker, Hari Han from Johns Hopkins, who looked at building coalitions across race and class in a faith-based initiative. And there are lots of things the environmental movement could learn about it. So the inter-domain and interdisciplinary side of things really stood out. And then specifically this narrower point on political violence.
Wow. And kind of going off of that, I do remember one paper discussing the dynamics among environmental coalitions and how they might have kind of competing goals depending on their political beliefs or, their beliefs about the approach of how to move forward with the sustainability movement. So a question I have is, and it made me realize how cooperation among these environmental organizations is equally as important. And so a question I have is, how can we best coordinate these goals and intentions of all different environmental organizations, not even just in the US, but across different countries with, different cultures and different political systems?
Yeah, that's a great question. So two things come to mind. One is we actually just got the latest publication of a speaker from last year at the conference who had done research on how this kind of how different types of environmental activism intersect, as you're saying. There have been some pretty high profile instances of disruption to traffic, for example, or damaging paintings in museums that supposedly were done in the name of protecting the environment and raising the awareness about the environment. So this recent study shows that those kinds of activism actually undermine public support for the environmental movement. So the kind of counter to your question is how should we not work together? I guess this sort of ways of being destructive that weren't directly linked to the environment, like blocking traffic and damaging art, really are detrimental to the movement. It seems like this is sort of hard to know what to make of from the social movement literature, because there's this idea that sometimes extreme tactics actually drive more support for middle kind of range actors. So I think a next follow-up has to be to think about whether those extreme actions actually do drive increased support for the more mainstream organizations, even if they detract from these more extremist approaches.
Boy, strategically, that's always interested me. This I remember, I think it being called the radical flank effect.
Yeah,
and I could
exactly.
wondering whether it just sounds so game theoretic almost, right? Among you sort of imagine the political center benefiting, and yet I hear what you're saying. Over the years, Tricia, I have been asking groups of students since I first came here in before the flood, as it were, a long time ago. But since 1991, I have always been, every year I ask the students one question, whatever class I'm teaching: who here is an environmentalist? Who sort of identifies? We didn't use that language initially, just who is, and then I came to be identifies. And just to see who would raise their hand. And so over time, the number of hands went up until right around the year 2000, I had the students objected to the question.
What and on what grounds?
The objection was, one student put it very well. He said, do I have to be a feminist to want women to be treated equally? Do I have to be an environmentalist to care about environmental sustainability? And it's interesting, because here we talk about the environmental movement, and essentially this was students objecting to even thinking of it as separate from their being integrated into their lives. And you probably didn't expect me to come up with this observation, but I thought of it as you were talking about this finding that the public might not want there to be a violent environmental movement and wouldn't identify with that.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense, that for some it's so deeply ingrained now in what they think of as just being a good citizen and a good person in the world. The other point I was thinking about in response to Sophia's great question, though, was this increasing polarization we see. So my own work on this topic about how we can, or how hard it is to work together, is about the rise of counter-climate nonprofit organizations. So in studying these organizations, I've been working with a postdoc and some students to track their spread around the world. So we find that as of 2022, now a third of countries in the world have at least one nonprofit organization that's actively working to undermine climate science and climate policy. So in terms of civil society activity, there's also the growth of a new set of actors who are really working in opposition to traditional pro-environmental organizations. So there's some very strong sort of counter-movement activity happening in the sector right now that I think makes it very hard, increasingly hard, Sophia, to your question of how to understand how to work together.
Well, let me. I'm gonna turn the tables on my co-host here. Sophia, you are the voice of the next generation on this podcast. And how do you feel And what do you think when you hear that organizations are actively pushing to not have policies and measures that would make the future better with respect to climate?
Yeah, so it's very discouraging, and I think it also really relates to one of the papers that was talked about in the conference about how we need a lot of optimism for the future generation, and I think right with the polarization going on with all of these kind of battles between different organizations, it sometimes feels really hard to make concrete progress because it just undoes itself by this other organization. But I think there's also just a lot of hope. I love that this conference is sharing so many kind of breakthroughs, not only in kind of like civil society, how or human organizations that there's that human interface, but also technology. On the other podcast, we talked about having more accurate measurements to understand our planet, having all of these research papers being published and understanding how we can move forward more sustainably as a society. I think all of this is also just really optimistic. So I think it's like very conflicting, as a student kind of taking in all of this information. But my hope is just that the general population will recognize that this is a pressing issue, and we can just use our passion, whether we're interested in technology or politics or some other front, to combat this challenge together.
Oh my gosh, I'm so inspired by what you've said there, Sophia. So Tricia, I'm going to give you the last word. How would you like to close off this podcast?
Oh my goodness, I can't follow Sophia's inspiring comments there. Sophia, it's really wonderful to hear this hope. And I feel the same way. I think there are a lot of areas for hope and a lot of people working very hard on this. And the group that we've been convening over the last few years, we're now all working together on a book that we'll put together to sort of help get some more of the most important findings over the last few years out there in open access format for more people. We have strong links to the practitioner community in our conferences as well. So we're really working with them and hopefully supporting these efforts.
Well, that's exciting too. Do you mind telling the name of the book, or do we just search up Professor Patricia Bromley new book? How do our listeners get a hold of this?
Hopefully we'll have it out next year, Bill, and I can give you more if we do this again.
Okay. All right. Well, with that, I'm going to say thank you to you listeners on behalf of Sophia Qin, Professor Patricia Bromley, and myself, Bill Barnett from Stanford University. Until next time.
The Stanford Initiative on Business and Environmental Sustainability podcast series is sponsored by the Stanford Graduate School of Business and the Stanford Doerr School of Sustainability. Music by Charged Particles. That's Caleb Hutzler, Mike Rock, and John Krosnick.